Dr. Wood, welcome to the Health Path podcast. It's a real treat to be able to speak with you today. I was just saying off air that I read one of the papers that you co-authored. I think I read it maybe about a year ago now, but it really started to help me understand some of the complexities and some of the questions that I had around nutrition and the gut microbiome. Which is kind of our topic, I guess, in some ways today. But before we dive into it, are you happy just to do a little bit of an intro into who you are and your work for those people that might not yet know you?
Sure. So I am a professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington in Seattle. I did most of my training in the UK. I grew up in Bristol, so undergrad, medical school. I was a junior doctor in London for a couple of years before I did my PhD. I now primarily focus basic research in the lab. I run a neuroscience lab trying to treat the injured brain. But throughout my various sort of medical and academic pursuits, I've been very interested in general health and performance. So I've worked with a number of athletes in a wide range of sports, professional athletes, as well as, sort of high level amateurs. And then, thinking about all the different ways that we might support somebody's long-term health. And one of those things, of course, is what we feed them and their guts. And there was a period of time where, I'd run hundreds of various gut tests on athletes and other people, trying to figure out ways that we could intervene and improve their health. And the more time you spend sort of looking at the gut, it's obviously it's critically important. But I think we realized over time that we know less and less. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And that kind of stimulated the idea of writing this paper. And it was based on a lot of work done by my friend and colleague for this paper, Dr. Lucy Mailing, who's a huge expert on the gut. And we kind of, had a bunch of questions related to, what do we really know about what makes the gut healthy? What do we really know, that we have to eat or should eat to improve the health of the gut? And it turns out that it's, probably a little bit more complicated than most people would think.
Yeah, and I think there are some key topics within that paper that you sort of raise as good examples of this, related to things like lipopolysaccharides and some of the research out there in regards to what a high-fat diet might do from that perspective. And you talk about bile acids and hydrogen sulfide, which seems to be quite a big topic in the nutritional therapy space at the moment.
Yeah.
But where do you think a good place to start with this sort of conversation is?
So I think maybe the framing of the paper was around high fat diets, in particular, maybe the discrepancy between what you call a high fat diet in the research versus what most people might think of when they're eating a high fat diet, which is something like a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. And those are two very different things, and that's where the discrepancy really begins, because in the research in animals, in order to stimulate obesity and gut dysbiosis and all these downstream health conditions in a specific strain of mouse, the black 6 mouse, which makes up something like 70% of all the animals used in research worldwide, something insane, like one very specific inbred strain of mouse that we use to decide all these things about human health, which is even that is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
This strain of mouse, and it's not the same from mouse to mouse, let alone from mouse to human, but this strain of mouse, if you feed it what they call a high-fat diet, it gets obesity and chronic inflammation and all this, and gut dysbiosis and all this stuff. But what they call a high-fat diet is essentially, close to 50-50, maybe there's 10% protein, and then the rest is a 50-50 mix of some kind of highly refined fat, usually maybe it's pork, lard, plus or minus some vegetable oils, and then sugar. So it's not really a high-fat diet, it's a cheesecake diet. And if you even just thinking about it like that, this is very different from somebody who might be getting most of their energy from fat on a ketogenic diet. And this is important for people who are doing that for, say, epilepsy, right? That's the way that they control their epilepsy, is with a ketogenic diet, right? And if they're told that high-fat diets are terrible for their gut microbiota and it's going to affect all these other problems with their health, right? It creates this tension. Like, do I have seizures, or do I like mess up my gut? Like, and I think that in reality, that's a false dichotomy. That's not really how things play out. But that's how the research looks in mice when they say high-fat diet. That's what they mean, cheesecake diet. And then similarly, there's research in humans where when we try and understand what humans eat and their health, probably most people don't realize how terrible that research is, mainly because it's really hard to know what somebody eats. And then there's this field of study that people have probably heard of called nutritional epidemiology, which is basically you ask people what they eat and then you look at their health outcomes. We know that the vast majority of nutritional epidemiology research is completely useless because the majority of calories are not reported by individuals. So you just don't know what people are eating. And one way to kind of get around that is to group foods together. So you don't talk about individual foods, but you talk about dietary patterns, right? Is somebody eating a whole, like something like a vegetarian or whole food plant-based type diet? Are they eating a Mediterranean type diet? Are they eating a Western type diet? And then you group foods together that people report commonly eating. But you'll have things like pastries and sweets and sugar and cakes, and they get lumped in with things like full-fat dairy and red meat, right? That becomes your Western dietary pattern. And the assumption is that all of those things then have the same effect on your health and the gut microbiota, which just like, can't be true. But they kind of, some of these things get like lumped in there, and automatically then we assume that they're bad, because then we look at the gut microbiota, we look at the health of the individuals, and we say, oh yeah, this is not as good as it could be. So then, the pastries are just as bad as the steak, which, there's completely different in terms of macronutrients, micronutrients, right? All those things are completely different. So that's the problem is, like, where does the research even stand to start with? That's where I think we can talk about that more. We can keep going, but that's where I think we need to start realizing how poorly we understand that, let alone anything that comes from that.
Yeah. I think those, as you say, just those points are enough to get you kind of scratching your head thinking, okay. And you make another really good point in that paper around the duration that some of these studies are going on for in humans. And you cite that study, I think it was done in patients with multiple sclerosis, and they went on to a ketogenic diet. And yes, maybe it's the 6-week mark, microbiome diversity has gone down, but at something like the 6-month mark, it's actually gone to a higher level than baseline, which is really interesting.
Yeah, this is there's this like famous quote that I use frequently when people are in the process of changing something about their health, which is that it often doesn't look good to start with, but you end up you dramatically change where you end up. And I think about, somebody once said that if you stopped heart surgery halfway through, it would look like murder, right? And I think this is kind of what's happening, that sort of the body has to adapt and change. And if you pick one thing, like you pick diversity, which may or may not be a good thing, but generally people say more diversity is probably better. And again, there are nuances to that. But yeah, if you have a dramatic shift in your dietary pattern, diversity will change as your microbiota changes, but then it may end up somewhere better. So it kind of just depends on when you look at it and how you look at it. And that's, I think, the danger of short-term studies, but also the danger of like one output. Like if you ask somebody about multiple sclerosis, whether they care about their gut diversity, of course they don't care about their gut diversity. They care about their long-term disability risk and their long-term quality of life, right? So is the thing that you're measuring even important? That's worth considering as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think I think it's very easy with how much of this, how accessible this information is. I think it can take people down rabbit holes, and people can start to micromanage parts of their diet or
Mm.
lifestyle, getting really fixated on numbers or test results and data. And as you say, unless you're getting an awful lot of data, it can be quite challenging to know what that might mean at that point in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think that's a pretty good intro into this concept. Um, so I guess moving forward from there, thinking around how even the structure of the diet in some of these studies is very poor, or when we're looking at humans, it can be limited. Um, do we have any data or research, I guess, that shows us that there may be more nuance to this? So studies that have looked at kind of high fat diets that might be a little bit more real world, for example.
Some of this I guess evidence that it's not as simple as people might tell you. It also comes down to how we interpret the data that we do get. So there's this paper that we reference. We even sort of published some of the figures from that paper where they put people on like a meat-based, animal-based diet and a plant-based diet, and then they looked at the production of these different metabolites. And so if you're eating a very fiber-rich diet, you produce more, in general, you produce more of these sort of traditional short-chain fatty acids that are thought to support gut function, like butyrate. But if you eat more meat and more protein, you produce more of these iso short-chain fatty acids, like isobutyrate, isovalerate. And there's one way to interpret that and say, well, fiber is the thing to eat because we know that butyrate is really critically important for gut health, right? That's what your enterocytes, your cells that line your gut, that's what they use as metabolic fuel. That's what they need in order to be, to function properly. But what's really interesting, and I think this is kind of where we went with the paper, is that that's not entirely true. Yes, your enterocytes can use butyrate. They're perfectly happy with butyrate. And actually, exogenous butyrate is a very interesting intervention that you can use in inflammatory bowel disease, maybe irritable bowel disease, some other things, that it's great. However, actually, the cells in your gut can use a whole range of fuels, including those iso short chain fatty acids. So if you happen to be eating more meat than more fiber, you're just producing a different fuel that also fuels the gut. The gut can also use ketone bodies, it seems like, and it will get those rather than getting them from inside the gut. It can get those from the other side, from the blood supply from the peripheral body, and then it can also probably use acyl carnitines from like the bile breakdown of fats. So if you kind of think about that, that tells you that regardless of whether you're eating a higher carbohydrate, higher fiber diet, or you're not eating at all, maybe you're in starvation ketosis, or you're eating predominantly protein, you will produce some metabolite that can support the function of the gut. And to me, that has to make sense. It has to work that way because humans didn't always have access to a bunch of soluble fiber, right? And so I often use myself as an example. There's a danger of using yourself as an example, but my ancestors, Northern European and Scandinavian, try looking for a starchy root vegetable in Iceland in the winter or ever. You're never going to find it. But are you telling me that the Vikings all had terrible, their guts were just falling apart because they didn't have enough fiber? Of course that's not true. The gut seems to be eminently adaptable to the food that you eat, and regardless of the food that you eat, you can produce some type of metabolite that can support the health and metabolism of your gut.
Yeah. And that seems to be just not a very well-known thing, at least in my perspective of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that component around that the cells that line the gut might be drawing some of these kind of fatty acids or ketones from the blood, it's like almost a bidirectional sort of relationship there in regards to where they're accessing material, so to speak. It's really kind of fascinating. And like you say, when you were talking there, what I was going to say, if you hadn't, was that just sounds like it makes sense, evolutionary speaking,
Yeah.
why that we would have that flexibility. One thing that would be interesting to pick your brain on is I've been reading a little bit recently around sort of pH and the role that that can play within the colon. And there's definitely some data kind of suggesting that it actually has a role to play within, I guess, influencing, like you were saying there, the function of bacteria. So in appropriate pH, bacteria may basically be behaving better.
Yeah.
But do we know what else kind of influences how bacteria are actually functioning?
So one thing that, again, people have really hyper focused on is one substrate having one effect, right? So particularly around fiber. But what I've seen frequently, like, working with individuals, and when people ask me about the gut now, I think we increasingly appreciate the effect of how the body affects the gut, not just like what we put in the gut affecting it, but how does the body affect the gut. And so, again, my friend Dr. Lucy Mailing, she's an expert on, she did a PhD on how exercise affects the gut. So we know that if you do a lot more physical activity, you improve a number of functions of the gut, and that's because you've improved, well, the function and health of the body in general, and that then influences the gut. There's some very nice work by guys like Sebastian Winter, who has a very cool gut lab, and what they've shown is that when you have inflammation in the gut, and this can be stimulated like by sort of exogenous things, or things that get the mice get. So this is in mice. The mice get fed, or it can be more peripheral inflammation. When there's inflammation in the gut, it affects the metabolism of the gut. So one way to explain that is that if you have inflammation, you shift what you're using as an energy source. You're less likely to use, say, fats that are metabolized in the mitochondria, and you're more likely to use glycolysis. What then happens is there's more oxygen around in the gut, which then changes which bugs can grow in the gut. So bifidobacteria, which I'm sure people have heard of and are big fans of because they seem to really generally support gut health and gut function, they're anaerobes, right? So they don't survive in an oxygen-enriched environment. So if you have inflammation, and this could be systemic inflammation driven by an autoimmune immune condition or something else, if that increases inflammation in the gut, that changes the metabolism of the cells in the gut, makes more oxygen available because they've shifted their energy source, and then that inhibits the growth of bifidobacteria because there's more oxygen around. So there's this really complex interplay between what's happening in the peripheral body and what's happening in the gut. However, I generally have increasingly focused on the health of the peripheral body because I know a bunch of ways to improve that. Physical activity, sleep, stress reduction, all of those things can have an impact. So I think generally when there's issues around gut health, we become hyper focused on what we eat, and then to the detriment of focusing on these other things that can have a big benefit as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. And I've started saying to clients, that the health of your microbiome is basically dependent on the health of you, because you are the host to those organisms. So they're not going to enjoy hanging out there if the host isn't particularly happy and healthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think another good example of, I guess, the complexities of this is the research on photobiomodulation, and showing how actually, infrared light can influence diversity and quantities of some of these keystone species, showing us that our light environment is also kind of important within this context.
Yeah, the research on light is very cool. I know more about it in relation to things like the brain, but you can directly stimulate mitochondria with the right frequencies of light, and that's sort of underpins so much about the health of our body in general.
Is there anything that you would like to share, I guess, from more of like a gut-brain perspective, as you sort of bring up the brain there?
Yeah, this is another thing that has become a big focus recently, and I talk a lot about cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, and I often get asked about the gut-brain connection, and it's obviously critically important. Like, what we eat certainly affects our brains. How our brain functions certainly affects how our gut functions. But I will also say that this is one area where, again, like, the more we know, the less we know, and you kind of see things like 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut, therefore the gut affects the brain. That doesn't make any sense. Like, your gut has its own nervous system. That's why it makes serotonin, so that it can signal cells in the gut. That doesn't inherently mean that the serotonin made in your gut goes up to your brain. That doesn't happen. So we know it's important. We know that there are aspects of the microbiota and gut health that seem to be associated with risk of neurodegenerative conditions, be that Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. The same with other, rheumatological conditions, for instance, like certain bacterial species and increased prevalence of rheumatoid arthritis and things like that. But unfortunately, we're really at a point where we don't yet know how to intervene. So you might measure these things in a population and say, oh yeah, these individuals with Alzheimer's disease, their gut looks more like this. But that doesn't mean that we know how to change that. It also doesn't mean that it's the gut that's driving it, or is it that, the health of the body in general is associated with or drives the risk of Alzheimer's disease, and then it also drives changes in the gut, and they're kind of two things that are correlated with the same thing, but they're not actually directly connected. So we know it's important, but we don't yet really know how we can intervene and change those trajectories.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, what you're saying there takes us back to the fact that we can't isolate one bodily system from the rest of the bodily systems. They're all interconnected, and therefore that's where that larger data sets become much more helpful, I guess, in understanding some of these connections.
Certainly hoping so. The problem is that to really understand very large data sets, right? If you imagine you have millions of data points, is which you need all the different species of bacteria in your gut with their relative abundances, with the proteins they're making, and then what's happening in the body, like what blood, what's the metabolome of your blood, what's circulating. Maybe you can measure some physical health markers. Maybe you can do some brain scans, right? To sort of unpick all of that, you also need to get that from a large number of people. And unfortunately, nobody's really doing that on the scale that you probably need to do it yet. I have huge hopes. There's some pretty good data sets, like the UK Biobank, right? 500,000 people. They've done some pretty impressive data collection. So we'll get there eventually. Like, I have strong hopes that we'll understand the microbiota and genetics, and that will tell us how you should eat, and which will improve your health. But right now, so I guess that's another good example of something that's been published very recently. Is so Day 2 as a company came out of Aaron Segal's lab in Israel, the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and they published some really impressive studies where they looked at blood sugar responses to different foods and saw that the same food in two different people had very different effects on blood sugar. And then they also looked at their gut microbiome, and then developed a test where you could kind of predict people's blood sugar responses to foods based on their gut microbiome. And they had a company, Day 2, and then they've also tried to use that in some interventional studies. So you give them a stool sample, they look at your microbiome, they say, these are the foods that you should or shouldn't eat for better blood sugar control. And they've tested it, and it kind of works in people in like type 2 diabetics. But they used a control group that just ate more carbohydrates. So it wasn't really a fair comparison. But then there was another study that came out recently where they looked at this in terms of weight loss. And so they had a group that just had, I think they had it's like a low fat diet control group. And then they had the group that got the gut test, and then personalized diet based on this gut test. Made no difference in terms of weight loss or anything to do, other health markers. So there's been this promise that we can use our gut microbiome or genetic tests are similar to say this is what you should eat for your health. Right now, that's not possible, and that's potentially depressing. But equally, I think it just allows us to better understand that humans can thrive on a wide variety of diets. That goes back to our gut metabolic flexibility. And so a little bit of personalization, a little bit of tinkering, a little bit of self-experimentation, I think can go a long way. And in my mind, that's really the gold standard still, rather than trying to rely on some of these tests, which so far have turned out to not be particularly helpful.
Okay. And yeah, I have this real, I guess, love-hate relationship with where we're at. This kind of, the dream of hyper-personalized lifestyle medicine, and as you say, being able to personalize the diet, maybe taking your personalized probiotic that has the strengths that maybe you don't have when you've done the right stool testing and things like this, compared to just thinking back, as you say, to our ancestors, and the fact that these epidemics of disease have come on in the last, I don't know, let's say 50 years. And before that, our health span arguably was better, but we had less knowledge back then. We had less access to all of these foods. And actually, do we sometimes just need to remember that ultimately and try and get a better balance between the two, the future and the past?
I mean, sometimes I could be considered a Luddite in my approach. I mean, because I'm resistant to some of these technologies, mainly because I've tried them and is eventually found them wanting. But so I'm a past president of a society called the Physicians for Ancestral Health Society, and some people might call it evolutionary medicine. The principles are very similar to what you might see in large parts of functional medicine or integrative medicine, or in reality, I think the core tenets are all the same. Even though then the implementation might be slightly different. But in reality, I think we have a good idea of what's important for our health, and it's related to sleep and light exposure and circadian rhythm and social connection and stress mitigation, and just eating a diet that looks like food and has some nutrients in it, actual micronutrients, which most ultra processed foods don't, and some physical activity, right? It's boring, right? But those things, like, consistently again and again and again, regardless of life stage, regardless of individual, regardless of chronic health condition, just have this huge impact. So I do believe in the future of technology and testing, and I love testing and data, and blood tests are something that I've spent a huge amount of time working on in various populations, but there's still a huge amount that you can get done, and probably the vast majority of what you can get done is just going back to those basic principles.
Yeah, and that's it. I think, as we sort of said earlier, we can get so lost in all of this information out there, but it does come back to some of those real foundations that a lot of us aren't doing consistently, as you say.
Yeah.
It would be really great if you're happy, Dr. Wood, just to touch on like the LPS side of things as well. So for those, there are going to be some people that might not yet be familiar with the concept. So even just kind of introducing LPS and lipopolysaccharides, and then some of what you discussed in that paper with high fat diets and how it might not be as black and white as we might think.
Sure. So this is something that I've changed my thinking on over the years, and again with help from Lucy, who's very well versed in some of the literature. But to kind of zoom out for a second, lipopolysaccharides are a group of endotoxins that sit in the wall of gram-negative bacteria. So things like E. coli, which are very make up a significant proportion of the cells in the gut, the bacteria in the gut. And if you sort of look at the effects of these endotoxins, some of them are very pro-inflammatory. They stimulate the immune system. They generate this huge immune response, and that's something that I use in the lab to help stimulate an inflammatory response that then can trigger a brain injury. So I take purified LPS and inject it, and then that can exacerbate a brain injury. And that's an important part of certain certain conditions, certain brain injuries. But that's one very specific type of LPS from E. coli. That's kind of like the standard in the field. But of course, there are a whole range of gram-negative bacteria in the gut that make a whole range of different endotoxins. When you look at individuals who have worse metabolic health, like those who have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, they generally have more circulating endotoxin, something that people call metabolic endotoxemia. And equally, if you give them a challenge of something like a very high-fat meal, and by that I mean actually a high-fat meal like drinking heavy cream, which is done in some studies, those individuals will have a greater increase in endotoxin in their blood, because endotoxins kind of from those bacteria get transported across the gut epithelium with fat. So there was kind of thought for a long period of time that, again, that was one reason why fat might be bad, is because it's increasing endotoxins coming across the gut. But there are two, kind of sides to that I think make it more nuanced. One, which is that you don't know the direction of this relationship between metabolic health and endotoxemia, because people who are in worse metabolic health, they have worse, like the health of the rest of the body is less good, and that may be affecting the gut. So it could be going the other direction. So you have prediabetes, that increases the permeability of the gut, and then more endotoxins come across, and it's not the endotoxins that are driving that. It's reverse causality. It's the other way around. So that's one part of it. And so if there are a bunch of things that we can do to improve blood sugar control and metabolic disease, like physical activity, which would mitigate some of that. And then the other side is that there are other endotoxins, other LPSs that seem to have this sort of beneficial modulatory effect on the immune system. So whenever you eat, your gut permeability goes up. It's completely normal. And part of the process of this sort of host gut microbiota interaction, this is a symbiosis essentially, is that our immune system has to sample like what's going on in the gut. So some of this is these endotoxins are essentially training our immune system to say, hey, this is who's here. We're the good guys. Don't worry about us. Right. So some endotoxins are actually beneficially signaling to our immune system to create tolerance, so that we, have this good symbiotic relationship. There is other evidence that I think supports some of this, like exercise is one of the best ways to increase gut permeability and increase endotoxins circulating, but nobody talks about exercise being bad because LPS increases. And this is, this goes back to this idea of if you look at heart surgery halfway through, it looks like murder, right? If you look at circulating endotoxins immediately after exercise, you'd be like, oh, exercise is terrible. Look at all these endotoxins. Look at all this LPS that's circulating. But again, this is, sort of part of this normal interplay between the host and the gut. So I think that, yes, there's certainly a possibility that if you had a significant dysbiosis that resulted in a bunch of more pro-inflammatory LPS being produced, and you have worse general health that's increasing circulating endotoxin, I think there's probably a subset of people where that's a meaningful issue that you could think about. But in general, I think we've been too worried about LPS and very focused on the problems with E. coli LPS, which we use in a purified form. We use it in the lab. We can inject it in humans and see these huge inflammatory responses. We're like, oh, this is definitely bad. But it kind of generalizes this wide variety of different LPSs to having one effect, when in fact, many of them could be having beneficial effects.
And there's some of them at least are escorted, right, around the body.
Yes, yeah. So they're generally escorted and cleared with LDL particles.
Okay, interesting. So I guess we've covered quite a lot in regards to the nuances and the complexities and some of the concerns we might have around the research and our current understanding of nutrition, high-fat diets, and how we're kind of extrapolating information from that. You do raise one of the caveats or concerns in the paper around sort of hydrogen sulfide and how, there might be certain situations where high protein, high fat diets aren't going to be appropriate. And that's obviously can be related to if there is an overgrowth of certain bacteria. Are you kind of able just to kind of touch on that?
Yeah, I think this is sort of, again, one sort of area that's become, hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria have become a focus, as under sort of the umbrella of dysbioses and overgrowths and certain subtypes of IBS. Obviously methane producing bacteria being another group that's received some focus. And anecdotally, actually, based on some research, it suggests that sort of a very animal protein and fat rich diet may promote or support the growth of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. So, and then from a clinical perspective, and this again comes from, I know Lucy's directly worked with a lot of clients in this way. She feels that at least short term, a low fat, fiber rich diet may be beneficial for those particular individuals. So it's not that anybody can eat anything and have great gut health. Maybe a bit this may sort of help us personalize diets from a therapeutic standpoint. And so that's one group where they may benefit from more fiber, less fat, because then they're sort of changing the available nutrients that can help shift back the microbiota.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point around the use of a therapeutic diet for a short point of time to reset things and to return to some sort of homeostasis, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a similar principle with like an elemental diet, right? And the people can, I think there's quite a bit of recidivism on those who go on an elemental diet, but for some individuals that can be enough to kind of create a shift that then allows a new set of species to take place that better supports gut health. But as with most things, I think with an elemental diet, it seems that anything more than 2 weeks doesn't seem to be more beneficial. So it's this short-term reset where you can then sort of try and build up a new set of species afterwards. And again, so these short-term interventions manipulating the diet can be beneficial in certain individuals, and that's if you're working with that kind of client, it's just good to have that in your toolkit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Brilliant. So with all that in mind, I think we've covered a lot of the key points within that paper that I wanted to flag. So I'm just going to kind of throw the ball into your court. And is there anything else that you just think would be interesting to share before we sort of finish off?
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that in that paper that we didn't cover. I think you're right. That's most of it. And probably the main takeaway, particularly if we're focusing on the gut, is and it relates to the body in general, is that we're eminently adaptable, and that's really what's made us the all-conquering, for want of a better phrase, species that we are. And I think one thing that becomes an issue with those who are hyper-focused on their health for many reasons is that we have almost this like learned fragility. Like we assume that this needs to be perfect in order for this other thing to be perfect, right? Here's how we have to perfect our diet so that our gut health has to be perfect. Here's how we have to perfect our sleep so that our health span is perfect. And the stress related to that perfectionism, I think it becomes a big issue. And this is something that I've seen increasingly with people using sleep trackers and blood glucose monitors and all these other tests, is that the focus becomes the result of the test when that shouldn't be the thing that you care about. What you care about is long-term health and physical performance and happiness and quality of life and those things. So I think remembering that the body is actually incredibly resilient, it's incredibly adaptable. Yes, there are some parameters that are important that we've already talked about, right? You should eat a real food diet. You should sleep. You should have social interaction. You should move. But outside the bounds of that, the body is capable of handling a lot of stuff in a beneficial way, and stresses, sort of increase our resilience and our adaptability and our, sort of our physiology in terms of what it's able to do. And that should then allow you to maybe focus less on some of these things and focus more on doing something with your body rather than focusing on your body itself. So that's kind of one thing that I'd like people to take away, is that, maybe there's a risk of being hyper focused on some things that then, draw us away from what is maybe more important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And actually, on this idea of resiliency and flexibility within the system, I stumbled across a paper this week that, if I remembered it correctly, basically took a group of people with a diagnosis of IBS, a group of healthy controls, and they followed them or did a couple of tests 6 months or so apart. And those who were referred to as sort of the healthy controls went from, if I get this right, they basically went from not having the capacity to produce methane to having the capacity to produce methane, while those with IBS had a very kind of similar profile ultimately. And you start to think that for some of these people with a chronic health issue, it's a system that's got stuck, basically. And actually what we're trying to do is to return it to a degree of flexibility and resiliency, which kind of ties in a lot, I think, with what we've been sort of talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Is there anything else that you would like to finish with, or do you feel that point you've just made around hypervigilance is a good conclusion? Because it's a good point, I think.
Maybe that's a good place to wrap up. It's quite technically dense, talking about the gut. Hopefully there's some useful tidbits in there. But of course, if there's more we need to do, more we need to dig into, people are welcome to reach out and ask me questions, or maybe you can link to the paper and they can read it if they're really interested in that.
Yeah, I'll link the paper to the show notes for sure, so people can check that out. Dr. Wood, thank you so much for sparing the time. It's been really great to chat with you and kind of pick your brain on these things.
Thanks so much for having me. It was always fun to talk about the gut. I really appreciate you reading the paper and having me on.
Thank you.
Cheers.